There's one obvious point, so obvious it's embarrassing to mention it, but I'll mention it anyway. And that is, in the case of any threat or use of violence, there is a burden. The burden of proof has to be met by those who advocate it, obviously. That's true whether it's domestic violence or violence in international affairs. And it's a very heavy burden. No one has to ever give an argument against the threat or use of violence. That's given. You're opposed to it, every sane person. So a strong argument has to be given for it. And it's not an argument to say, for example, what else can I do? If someone's beating their wife and children and they say, what else can I do? That's not an argument. Same in international affairs. Or to take the lead story in today's Toronto Star, if we could talk to the people who carried out an attack on a kibbutz in Israel yesterday and ask them, why are you doing it? They can't just say, what else can I do? That's not an argument. I think that suffices to eliminate the arguments that are given for the bombing of Iraq, but we could discuss that. In any event, one thing is clear. The burden of proof is on those who advocate violence or even the threat of violence, and it's a heavy burden. Just one other comment, the basic issues were framed reasonably well on the lead in the stories in the press today, so just keep to that. There are two extreme positions expressed, one by the Bush administration, Andrew Card this time, who reiterated the position that the administration has been making extremely clear. No one should be deluded about it. He said something approximately like this, that we regard ourselves as having any authority we need to attack Iraq. The Security Council can meet and discuss it if they like, but that has of no particular interest to us. That's the position that has been made clear and explicit throughout. It was reiterated again this morning, yesterday's news conference. Another position at the other extreme, which was reported at the Washington Post, Toronto Star picked it up, was the position of the Arab League, which endorsed the UN resolution, claiming that they had explicit guarantees from Colin Powell that it was not a trigger for war. That is, that the White House position is false. You can make up what you like about that. And interestingly, reiterating, according to the story, introducing, but in fact reiterating, a position which is rarely mentioned. The Arab League statement called for regional disarmament, not just disarmament of Iraq. That was called a new proposal. It's not. That's part of Resolution 687, the UN resolution that's appealed to constantly as authorizing war. Actually, it doesn't do that, but it does call for disarmament of Iraq, and also calls for moves towards general regional disarmament. That's Article 14, which is always omitted in the press coverage of this or the White House coverage. That goes back 10 years. That was the issue right before the first Gulf War. It's kind of more or less marginalized, but the issue, a major issue at that time, was whether Iraqi withdrawal could take place from Kuwait, as Iraq had in fact proposed, within the framework of a regional conference on general regional problems of armaments, threats, and so on, which is all a code word for Israeli weapons of mass destruction. There apparently was such a proposal, was turned down by the United States, was not reported by the press. Independently of that, 2/3 of the population in the United States supported it right before the bombing, not knowing that the proposal had been made and turned down. If they had known that it had been made and turned down, probably it would have been a much higher percentage, and it would have been much harder to initiate that war. And it's possible that withdrawal could have been achieved. State Department negotiators thought it was quite possible without the devastation of war and all the horrors that followed, leaving plenty of problems, but moving on to what is a very serious regional problem, namely the capacity for destruction and violence, which is there. and is recognized by the U.S. government. So, for example, the former head of the Strategic Air Command, Strategic Command, I mean the major government body that deals with nuclear weapons, General Lee Butler, pointed out a couple of years ago that the main problem of proliferation in the region is Israel's nuclear capacities, which are far beyond anyone else's, and are part of the U.S. system of regional and global dominance. And Butler pointed out that as long as that exists, of course, it's contributing to proliferation and violence and so on, and something has to be done about it. That's a reference, really, to the United States. Those are two opposite positions on what's happening, and the issues, I think, my feeling is, ought to be framed in that context.
Maybe one question. So now, so I am from the Swiss radio.
From
Swiss radio, and
Swiss radio.
Italian speaking. So I try to
Yeah.
express myself
Okay.
in English. And now everybody, or at least the U.S. government, says that what they want is to disarm Iraq. Many people say that there is other reasons. For instance, the volunteer of having a hand on the petrol there, or maybe the volunteer of take the attention of the United States away from inner problems like Enron economy problems. What is your point of view about that?
Well, I agree with the second position. It's, I think, in fact, close to truism. And it's expressed very clearly right in the mainstream. I mean, you don't have to go out to the fringe to find it. So, for example, in last week's International Herald Tribune, there was an article by a senior fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations, Yusuf Ibrahim, who's been the lead Middle East correspondent for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal for 30 years. You could hardly get more respectable than that. And he says exactly what you just said. He said there are two reasons for the war. One is George Bush's, the administration's domestic political problems, which accounts for the timing. That's why it has to be now, not, say, next year. And the long-term one is the fact that Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world. It's been obvious for a long time that the U.S. is going to do something to regain control of them. September 11th, I'm not going beyond his article, September 11th provided a pretext, as it a pretext for many other things, like the intensification of Russia's war in Chechnya and all sorts of other things. So it was a pretext to do all kinds of things. And the domestic political problems explain the timing very clearly. In fact, the Republican campaign managers virtually say it. So the tactic worked brilliantly in the current, just past congressional elections. It was possible to, people's attention was turned away from the problems that really concern them very seriously, namely the assault that's being carried out against the general population by the current administration, which is not so concealed. But the attention was turned away from that to the fear of the monster going to destroy us and the brave cowboy who's going to save us. And that's going to be even more important a year from now, which is why the war has to be now, not next year. That'll be the middle of a presidential campaign. And if you think about, say, Karl Rove, Republican campaign manager, the last thing he wants people to think about is the fact that there are new tax cuts for the rich. The country's being purposely sent into a big fiscal crisis to cut back social spending. That's going to attack the limited medical support system that exists. Pensions will be shaky if they'll even exist. Those are the environments being destroyed. I mean, that's not what you want people to think about when they're coming into an election. What you want them to think about is, praise for the magnificent leader who saved us from imminent destruction by, Hitler, and is now marching on to some new triumph. This is classic. This is, in fact, for the people now running the Washington policy, it's second nature. This is simply a replay of what they did 20 years ago. It's pretty much the same people who were in the Reagan administration. Actually, you can read this in the lead story in this morning's Wall Street Journal, if you like, though they put it a bit obliquely. But what they point out, which is correct, is that the current Bush administration, which is it's many of the same people who were in the Reagan administration, did exactly what they did 20 years ago. They quickly drove the country into a big deficit by number of factors, but the ones under their control were a tax cut for the rich, about 40% go to the top 1%, and a big government. Remember, this is a big government. Republicans are in favor of a very big government, but a government for the rich. So they increased government. In fact, the Wall Street Journal points out correctly that this was the biggest increase in federal government spendings in 20 years. 20 years happens to be when they did it the first time. And now they're doing it again, and the purpose is quite clear. You have to be pretty blind not to see it. But you don't want people to be paying attention to that. It's okay if readers of the Wall Street Journal do, they're trustworthy, but not the people who are going to vote. They shouldn't be paying attention to it. So yeah, the timing is, it's clear that they have to drive the war very fast. It's got to be over before the presidential campaign starts, then you're on to the next. And the long-term interest is what Yusuf Ibrahim pointed out. It's the second largest oil reserves in the world. It's not a matter of access. The United States doesn't care about access to them. In fact, doesn't even tend to use them. It's a matter of control, which is something quite different. If you control oil resources, first of all, you can guarantee that the enormous wealth that flows from them will go to the right people, like U.S. energy corporations and British energy corporations and the U.S. Treasury and the military industry, which will have contracts and so on and so forth. So it's that. And then it's commonly pointed out, the State Department pointed out 55 years ago, it's a stupendous source of strategic power, quoting the State Department. And strategic power means world control. So it's not a matter of access, it's a matter of world domination and ensuring that the wealth goes to the people who matter. And those things are important. So yeah, those are, I'm sure Ibrahim's correct.
Given the unanimous resolution from the UN Security Council, it pretty much seems like a foregone conclusion at this point that there is going to be a military strike on Iraq.
Depends how you interpret the
I'm
resolution.
wondering what your view of that
yeah.
is.
Well, I mean, on paper there was a unanimous resolution. In fact, there was not. There was a resolution supported by the U.S. and Britain and opposed by everybody else. That's exactly the split that I just mentioned. The wording of the resolution does not give the U.S. any authorization to do anything, but the Bush administration made it extremely clear, couldn't be clearer, before the resolution was passed, right after it was passed, and again today, that it interprets the resolution as giving it the right to do anything it wants. So, to repeat, the Security Council can talk if they like, but we have the right to do anything we want. Okay. I mean, you really have to be dedicated to self-delusion not to see this. I mean, there is some, actually the front page story in the New York Times about it right before the resolution was, as the resolution was being introduced, and it was accurate. It said something like this: despite the diplomatic niceties, Washington is going to interpret the resolution as authorization to attack Iraq when it chooses to do so. And that's accurate. The diplomatic niceties are there so that writers of editorials can talk about the wonders of diplomacy and multilateralism and so on. And commentators can praise Colin Powell and do all these usual things. But the reality is exactly the way they described it. And since the administration is being very open and clear about it, if one wants to be deluded, it's a choice. But there's no reason to.
Is there anything that average North Americans can do at this point to thwart a military strike?
To oppose it?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge opposition. I mean, it's in fact, it's completely without any historical precedent. I mean, I don't think I've talked to anybody. I'm talking all the time. I haven't seen an audience of less than a couple of thousand people for a long time, and it's mostly about this now. And there's huge demonstrations of protest. Just ask yourself, when has that ever happened? When in the entire history of European imperialism, counting the U.S. as part of Europe, in the entire history, when has there been massive opposition to a war before it began? It's never happened. And it's not just here. It's in England, Italy. There were a couple 100,000 people the other day. This is new. It's never happened before. I mean, people mention Vietnam, but they forget what happened in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, the U.S. had been attacking South Vietnam quite publicly for 4 or 5 years. Frankly, it had destroyed the country before there was any protest.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you could offer some context on the sealing off of like a quarter to a third. I was wondering if you could offer some context for the sealing off of like a quarter to a third of Kuwait and the closure of the Al Jazeera office there.
Well, the Al Jazeera office has been a thorn in the side of all the governments of the region and also the United States because it just reports independently. And they don't like that. When the Emir of Qatar was in Washington right after 9/11, he got a dressing down by Colin Powell, who demanded that he control and cut back Al Jazeera because it was just much too open and free. And he then gave a press conference in Washington, which as far as I'm aware nobody attended, in which he kind of ironically informed the American press that there was such a thing as freedom of the press, and Qatar was going to protect it, even if the U.S. State Department was opposed. Didn't see much. Actually, it was reported in the Wall Street Journal. I didn't see it anywhere else. And that continues. I mean, as when the U.S. was bombing Afghanistan, as the Northern Alliance was moving into Kabul, and the Taliban fled. The last thing that the U.S. did before their own forces took over was to bomb the Al Jazeera station in Kabul. There was a missile attack on it. They claimed it was an accident, or they thought it was an arms depot or some story, but nobody believed that. Actually, I was in Islamabad a couple of days later, and there was huge press, massive press there, people just laughing. The Al Jazeera people took it for granted that, of course, they were bombed, and the reason was clear. They didn't want filming of what was going to happen. Al Jazeera, well, you can think what you like about it, but it's very open. I mean, it has everyone from high Israeli officials to radical Islamists. I should just to be honest, they've even interviewed me a couple of times. So they're pretty far out. But they just have lots of things, and it's been an eye opener in the Arab world, and everybody tunes into it from all over. The governments hate it, of course, and keep trying to close it down. And the U.S. government hates it too. So yeah, they want to get it out of Kuwait. Opening up areas of Kuwait to, well, that's just part of the preparation for war. I mean, it's worth remembering that even Kuwait is opposed to the war. I mean, in fact, there's no one in the region who can be found who's in favor of the war outside of Israel. There's strong opposition, even from Kuwait and Iran, both of which were invaded by Saddam Hussein when he was a U.S. ally, incidentally. And of course, they hate Saddam Hussein. In fact, most people in the region despise him, but they don't fear him because they know there isn't much he can do. The only people who are afraid of him are American in the United States because they're terrorized by the propaganda. So George Bush tells them every day that if we don't do something now, he's going to bomb us tomorrow, and it works sort of. And the other people who are afraid of him are Iraqis. But that's not, and they have good reason to be, but that has nothing to do with the war. They're going to be even worse off. They're even more opposed to the war for good reason. But the people in the region aren't afraid. I mean, they're afraid, but they're afraid of the United States, like most people in the world. They're not afraid of Saddam. They hate him, but they're not afraid of him. And there's perfectly good reasons. I mean, look, everyone wants him disarmed. But just even imagine, suppose he had nuclear weapons. What would he do with them? I mean, like, suppose I had nuclear weapons in my garage, say. Could I do anything with them? Well, there's no, nuclear weapons are of no use whatsoever unless people know you have them, right? Like if I have them in my garage and nobody knows about them, I can't use it as a threat, and I can't use it as a deterrent, right? You have to make it obvious that you have them. Well, the instant Iraq indicates in the most marginal way that it might have weapons, nuclear weapons, it's going to be obliterated. Okay, and if take say the Rand Corporation or the Pentagon, I'm sure they have. I mean, they have groups meeting on every imaginable contingency. Actually, they even have contingency plans to invade Canada, if you're interested. They do. There's a good book on it. But so they have contingency plans for anything. But I'll bet you they don't even have a committee dealing with the likelihood that Saddam Hussein will threaten anybody with weapons of mass destruction. It's outlandish. I mean, nobody wants him to have them, of course. But the minute he gave any indication of having them, it's suicide. Okay, if he wants to commit suicide, there are easier ways. Slit his throat.
North Korea just recently announced that it was still pursuing nuclear capability. Why the lack of response by comparison to the U.S.'s dealings with Iraq? What would be the motivation for just sort of ultimately forgetting about it? It's out of the press now.
Yeah, well, I think the reasons are the ones that were suggested before, and that I quoted Yusuf Ibrahim, but I can quote many others. North Korea does not have the second largest oil reserves in the world, and conflict with North Korea wouldn't help at all for political reasons. In fact, it would be a catastrophe. The first thing that would happen is North Korea would attack South Korea and wipe out Seoul and Japan. Who knows what would happen? So there's no political gain to be made by that. The fact that North Korea announced it is probably, we don't have all the intelligence reports, but it's very likely that the U.S. knew about this for some time. And the question is why the U.S. decided to release the information now. And that you can debate. And what North Korea is up to, you can also speculate. The usual, the standard assumption in the region and among analysts is that, and in South Korea and Japan as well, is that North Korea is playing a kind of a desperate game to try to gain some, to use these threats as a negotiating card to get aid which it desperately needs. It's facing starvation and destruction. And if we were sensible about this, we would follow the lead of South Korea. They're the ones who have the most involved. And their position is, we have to use this for further diplomatic efforts to try to resolve the problem. And it's a serious problem. I mean, if North Korea were to collapse, as it could, it would be a complete disaster for South Korea. I mean, they would suddenly, integrating East Germany into West Germany was a serious problem. And this would be infinitely worse. I mean, it's a collapsed country. South Korea isn't that powerful. Probably drive South Korea into vast decline. I mean, you can read about all of this in the Far Eastern Economic Review and the standard sources. But yeah, that's anybody sensible wants to somehow integrate North Korea into the world, Korea and the world system without causing a catastrophe, which won't be easy.
Do you see any sort of the U.S. responding to any international pressure, say, being in the Canadian anti-war movement? It feels somewhat hopeless to sort of pressure the Canadian government to act, try and influence the U.S. government, because it seems that they're not really responding to international pressure at all. So do you see any role of, say, the Canadian government in influencing the U.S. at this point?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, how much of an influence you can debate. I mean, the point is there's clear split among policy planners in Washington and the sort of penumbra of advisors that they have. I mean, they're all hawks and reactionaries. But there is there's a narrow, ultra-reactionary, fanatic group of extremists who are very close to power in Washington, Rumsfeld, Pearl, Cheney, and the rest. And they're frightening the hawks. So put aside, somebody's tape recorder went off. Just a couple of days ago, the main sort of hardline, respected military analyst, strategic analyst for the Gulf region, is Anthony Cordesman, writes all the major papers and so on. And just recently, he warned Washington not to pay attention to what he called neoconservative extremists and silly armchair strategists and their crazy plans for reconstructing the whole region, which people like him find frightening, as do many right-wingers. And there is a split. But he's talking about people like Rumsfeld, Pearl, and Feith, Cheney, the ones who are really planning policy. And they not only have the world frightened, they have hawks in Washington frightened. And for good reason. That's why you're getting people like Yusuf Ibrahim writing things like I just quoted, which is pretty unusual. World opinion is going to have an effect on those, how those forces play out. The more sane hardliners understand that the United States can't just run roughshod over the whole world because it, has approximately, it's so overwhelming, has such overwhelming military power. The extremist elements, the radical extremists, they scoff at it. They think we have overwhelming military force and we can just compel anybody to do anything we want. If they don't like it, get lost. And that split exists, and it's going to be influenced by public opinion and activism in the United States and in the world. And these things interact. Like when people in the United States read about 400,000 people in the streets in Italy, that spurs action in the United States and so on. It's an integrated world. So there's plenty that can be done. I mean, whether it's enough, we'll know in a couple of months.
Yeah, this is what I'm wondering. I mean, is it enough? I mean, is the U.S. war machine sort of an unstoppable force at this point?
I don't think it's
I think
it's
a
never
lot of people are
unstoppable.
very, very concerned and
Yeah, they are.
really, really quite depressed.
They are.
With that prospect.
Yeah. I was in Europe a couple of weeks ago, and people feel hopeless. They feel there's nothing you can do to stop the juggernaut. Well, they're wrong. There's a lot that can be done. Somebody else's tape recorder went off. How this will play out, nobody knows. You never know. If you look at historical precedents, it's gone every way you like. Take, say, the same people 20 years ago when they were coming in the Reagan administration. It was very clear that they were trying to follow, their main concern then was Central America. And they were trying to follow the course that was laid out by John F. Kennedy, who was their model, with regard to Vietnam. So they went through exactly the same steps. And the press went along as usual and so on. But there was an unanticipated popular reaction in the United States, and they had to back off. So they didn't invade Nicaragua directly. There were no B-52s. There were hundreds of thousands of American troops rampaging around Central America. They resorted to massive terrorist atrocities, which practically wiped the place out. But it wasn't as bad as B-52s and the troops running around. And they just had to back off because of public opinion. Or if you go back, you may recall that the German justice minister was fired a couple of weeks ago because of saying some obviously true things, which are impolite. She pointed out that Germany in its own history has some recollection of how unscrupulous leaders were able to frighten a very civilized population into hysterical fanaticism with consequences we don't have to talk about. But one of the things that she didn't discuss, and which is worth thinking about, is that the Nazi leadership didn't trust their own population. There was too much internal disorder and dissent. So they had to fight what nowadays is called a guns and butter war. They had to pacify the population by giving them crumbs while trying to fight a war, which is very much what Lyndon Johnson had to do in the late 60s, guns and butter war. And just as in the case of Vietnam, it harmed the war effort. The Allied powers, Britain and the United States, where they trusted their populations, were able to become virtually totalitarian during the Second World War. There was a national mobilization, everybody participated, you didn't have to worry about buying washing machines and so on and so forth, because people just eagerly participated. So the democracies were able to become far more totalitarian than the totalitarian states, and that gave them an advantage in fighting the war. The Nazi economic czar, Albert Speer, in his autobiography, his memoirs, claims probably plausibly that this probably set the German war effort back by about a year, which could well have been the difference between victory and defeat. Remember, toward the end of Germany was way more technologically advanced than the Allies. It was mostly just Russian massive force that was defeating them. And the V2s were coming along. In another year, they might have been able to hit New York. And nobody knows what would have happened. So yeah, even the most extreme, mass murderers and killers have to pay attention to their own to public opinion. They can't ignore it, and that goes all the way back through history. So nothing's hopeless.
When you say that there is a lot that can be done, and I think this is one of the reasons why, for instance, here in Hamilton, people have just been clamoring to get tickets to hear what you have to say. I think what they're hoping for are some solid, concrete suggestions.
No, there are none. They're going to be disappointed. The only concrete suggestions are what everybody knows and has known for a long time. The thing is to do it. Okay, I mean, we all know how to protest and dissent and organize and educate and so on. These are things that everybody knows. The hard thing is to do something about it. So if there were any magic keys about how to proceed, somebody would have told us a couple hundred years ago. But whatever you're interested in, whether it's getting rid of slavery or women's rights or saving the environment or stopping a war and so on, the ways of doing it are perfectly well known. It's a matter of will, not knowledge. They want the war to be over by the time the presidential campaign starts and on to the next. Okay, and that's in the works. So, roughly, Israel is not an independent country anymore. It's basically an offshore military base of the U.S. And as such, even though it's a small country, it's a very powerful military force. So according to IDF analysts, Israeli Army analysts, its air and naval forces are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power outside the United States. And over 10% of them are permanently based in eastern Turkey, big U.S. bases there, and they're flying at the Iranian border. I mean, they don't care much about Iraq. They figure it's kind of a pushover, but they are very concerned about Iran. And there are probably plans in the works, some scholarly literature on this, to try to go on to dismember Iran and then reorganize the whole region. In fact, some of them are in public. Actually, that's what Kurdistan was referring to, these long-term plans, which are semi-public, which are scaring the hawks. But yeah, and so I think the idea is to have a build up Saddam Hussein as some foe of monstrous proportions, have a miraculous victory, in which we were saved by the courage of the cowboy, and then we all huddle in fear and praise our leader and go on to the next. The German justice minister was exactly correct in describing the model. That worked very well in Germany. I mean, as long as Hitler was winning victories, easy victories, he was the most popular leader in German history. And Germany is it's not the Taliban. I mean, this was the center of Western civilization, the most advanced culture in the world, science, arts, literature, everything, peak of Western civilization. And it turned out not to be that hard to drive people into terror that Western civilization, meaning Aryan civilization, was under attack by the Jews, and they had to fight a war of self-defense to protect themselves from this monstrous peril. and they did, and as long as there were easy victories, it was very popular, especially when the population was being paid off with the crumbs. It's an extreme case of the model, but it's a familiar model. And I'm sure that they're thinking of what went wrong in 1991, 92 when they didn't do it properly. So in fact, remember what they did then. After the war in Iraq, which in my opinion, was avoidable, but to go into that. But anyway, after the war, there was a popular uprising in southern Iraq, which might very well have overthrown Saddam Hussein, had rebelling Iraqi generals and so on. And Colin Powell and George Bush the first decided to let Saddam crush it. Okay, so for reasons that are pretty well discussed, and that left a pretty ugly taste. So it wasn't just that the end of the war, but Saddam was in place. He just crushed the rebellion with U.S. support. Didn't look like a magnificent victory. Then the economic problems came along, and they lost the election.
Is concerned, like they're.
Well, that's why the U.S. is putting tremendous. Let's take Canada. The U.S. is putting a lot of pressure on Canada to increase what's called defense spending. Defense means offense. That's standard. So they want Canada to increase military spending for offensive purposes. Part of the reason is exactly what you say. After the U.S. wins the war in Iraq, it wants countries like Canada to come in and run the country, okay, militarily. It's called peacekeeping, and make sure that it works the right way. Like the U.S. will maintain control of the oil resources, and the wealth will flow in the right place, and Canada will pay the costs. That's the role of Canada in the international system. Not just Canada, others will be enlisted for the same purpose. And they want to make sure that some kind of government will be there, which will have some kind of facade of democracy. So it'll probably have a parliament, a prime minister, and so on. But it'll be a military-run government under the control of Western power, meaning U.S. power, with the kind of the client states like Canada and others doing the dirty work. That's probably the plan.